Rights and Science. And I'm going to cite from the course reading on the syllabus. And I'm also going to cite other scholarship regarding transgender rights, science, and the medical establishment. So Canada has passed comprehensive legislation in support of gender expression and gender identity. So Bill-C16 adds gender expression and gender identity as protected grounds to the Canadian Human Rights Act and also to the Criminal Code provisions dealing with hate propaganda, incitement to genocide, and aggravating factors in sentencing. The law amends the Canadian Human Rights Act by adding gender identity or expression as a prohibited ground of discrimination. That makes it illegal to deny services, employment, accommodation, and similar benefits to individuals based on their gender identity or gender expression to matters within federal jurisdiction, such as the federal government, federal services to the public, or a federally regulated industry. A person who denies benefits because of the gender identity or gender expression of another person could be liable to provide monetary reimbursement. Lola Olufemi is a British feminist writer who has written a book called Feminism Interrupted, Disrupting Power. And Olufemi discusses the relationship between the British feminist movement and transgender rights. And there have been a lot of prominent cases in the media of transphobic people or who are often referred to as TERFs. And I'll discuss TERFs also at the end of the lecture. So TERF is an acronym for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. First recorded in 2008, the term TERF was originally used to distinguish transgender inclusive feminists from a group of radical feminists. Feminists have rightly been concerned with the process of sex assignment. They recognize that throughout history, to be female has often meant death, mutilation, and oppression. Sex categorization has been the starting point for well-known feminist theories, but the idea of sex as immutable became a focal point of radical lesbian feminism in the West, and more specifically America, during the 70s and 80s. This was not the case across the board, especially among Black feminists, but there are many notable instances of organizing that were hostile towards trans women during this time. So what the author for the reading discusses, Kettle Slagstead, who is a medical doctor, are the ways that this kind of gender-centric thinking, the reliance on an idea of biological determinism, meaning that we cannot depart from the gender identity we were assigned at birth, has really informed medicine. And Slagstead is concerned with the ways that cisnormativity and transphobia have informed medicine attitudes towards gender. And Slagstead is interested in how the reliance on this model of cisnormativity and the assumption that one is a natural gender, and this constant repetition of a discursive nature has really been detrimental to the progress of medical research. So
Slagstad is critical of the ways that medical research often begins by staging a series of questions that already have presuppositions built into the hypothesis, meaning that one already assumes that gender is natural and innate and not performative. And so Slagstad's article is interested in how the current theoretical debates and political debates regarding transgender rights could have a positive impact on medicine, so that one would move away from framing medical questions and questions of scientific research in gender terms.
In our current cultural moment, discussions about whether sex and gender are spectrums or dichotomies have taken center stage. Defenders of transgender rights are often accused of pushing identity politics or gender ideology, but the current situation has not appeared out of the blue. Attempts to define sex and gender have been a recurrent theme in medical history, and because the topic of transgender rights is necessarily also a medical one, this legacy underpins the current debates. A greater awareness of this history can help doctors become more responsible, empathetic, and reflective when we meet with transgender and gender nonconforming patients.
So Slagstad discusses the ways that transgender history has changed attitudes towards health and sexual health. One of the examples that is most obvious is research regarding reproduction. And in the last class, we talked about abortion and pro-choice movements. So assumptions regarding reproduction as being tied to cis-normativity and gender identity have really shaped a lot of early medical research. But because of the feminist movement and the transgender and queer rights movement, a lot of scientific research has changed. And so rather than assuming that childbirth is something that is inevitable because of the gender identity one is assigned at birth or because of one's capacity to give birth, scientific research often looks at things like harm reduction and pain reduction, and also long-term health. And Canada obviously has laws protecting people's right to have an abortion, and also protecting people's rights to express their gender identity in whatever way they choose to, including medical surgeries, which would change one's appearance and one's gender assignment. If somebody chooses to have medical procedures and then also change their gender identity or expression. So trends in politics and the politicization of subaltern groups of people can change scientific research questions and can force people in the medical establishment and in positivist scientific disciplines to question the underlying bias that might inform their research.
Milestone in transgender history occurred in 2019 when the World Health Organization removed gender identity disorder from the chapter on mental illnesses in the International Classification of Diseases and replaced it with a new diagnosis of gender incongruence in a new chapter on sexual health. Transgender people were thus no longer labeled mentally ill, and trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming identities were recognized as expressing human variation.
So I think this is another really interesting part of Slagstad's research, and it's something that we've discussed throughout the class, and I've given previous lectures about eugenics and Nazism. So constructing certain groups of people as criminal or deviant or morally suspect because of the appearance of the human body, or because of non-normative traits, because one does not appear to be the same as the majority, is historically the way that science has always been used as an alibi for nation building, and sometimes in very extreme ways for an alibi to removing minorities from the public sphere. The pathologization of transgender people is part of medical history. So constructing transgender people and queer people as being pathological or sick is part of the history of medicine throughout the Western world. And the reasons that transgender rights are important in medicine are similar to the ways that comprehensive research regarding the rights of women and people of color are also important in moving science away from this history of nation building and this history of exclusion.
Repeatedly throughout the history of Western thought, nature has provided a rich resource for shaping norms, settling categories, and stabilizing concepts of normality. What counts as natural and what role nature plays in the order of things, however, are historically contingent. In the center of the medieval and Renaissance concept of nature, for instance, stood the goddess Natura, who protected heterosexual sex and the continuation of the human species. In the history of medicine, the common has often been equated with the normal. In the past 150 years, we've seen how diagnostic and classificatory systems have pathologized and stigmatized people whose bodies, identities, or desires did not fit social norms. However, history also provides examples of doctors listening to the needs of trans and intersex patients and using medical knowledge to provide empathetic care. By shaping and guarding the concept of sex, doctors have enabled some bodies and ways of living while invalidating others. Ultimately, the medical categories of homosexuality, intersex, and transsexualism have shaped contemporary understandings of sex. The history of medicine offers an antidote to the notion that we are simply looking at nature when we see sex and gender. What counts as sex and gender is historically changeable, morally infused, and politically loaded. So the second concept is performativity. Sex is gender, and the way we think about both is entirely social. If one group of people consistently behave, speak, move, present themselves in one way and another, in the opposite way, we reaffirm the idea that there is actually an inherent difference between those two groups when no such difference exists. While male and female bodies may have different physical capabilities in particular contexts, these differences in regards to testosterone and estrogen are not only exaggerated, there's also a whole range of variations across members of the opposite sex. Many women are stronger than men. Many men are weaker than women. These are not exceptions that defy a rule. There simply is no rule. Biological differences are often exaggerated to explain phenomena that are entirely unconnected: personality, social and political interests, cognitive ability. To argue that there is a clear difference between sex and gender serves to solidify the idea that biological sex, prior to human beings inventing it and naming it, its tenets, exists. To say that gender and sex are social constructions is not to say that they are unimportant or that gender is as simple as putting on a different hat each day. Butler is often misquoted as claiming gender is a performance, when instead she argues it might be better to view it as a ritual that is made up of certain kinds of repetitive behaviors that sediment over time. When we repeat this behavior, we create ourselves. Because of the way it organizes our lives, gender has life or death consequences. Consider the way that anyone who does not conform to ideas of their assigned sex is heavily policed. So
I think one of the interesting research questions that you might think about for your assignments or in future for graduate school or in your own artistic work or writing is to think about how gender is policed. What are the ways that gender is policed? And I think the medical establishment is one way in which gender identity and intersections of class and intersections of race and religion are all kind of normalized. The idea of health, I think, can involve a policing of gender identity and expression, unfortunately. And this is something that Judith Butler and other queer and feminist scholars have discussed in detail, but people who are writing in the liberal arts and humanities are often apart from the world of science. And unfortunately, I think expressing a gender identity that is perceived to be non-normative and challenges cis-normativity can still have consequences in terms of how people are treated by doctors. And also, as I'll discuss as the lecture goes on, drawing on interviews with lawyers in America, the medical establishment is not separate from other institutions such as the legal establishment. So transgender people's access to gender affirming care has recently been called into question throughout the United States of America. And this corresponds with the ruling, which is the Supreme Court versus Dobbs ruling, which overturned abortion in many states throughout America.
Next concept is harm. In the Americas, 80% of trans women killed as a result of gendered violence are 35 years of age or younger. So this is a clip of Chase Strangio discussing transgender rights and transphobia.
Is not. Black Friday sales. Managed WordPress hosting now from only $249 a month. Get epic savings.
Or more bills introduced.
Anti-trans laws are sweeping through state houses across the country, attacking pretty much every aspect of trans existence, from healthcare to schooling.
Members of the committee, my name is Chase Strangio.
Chase Strangio has been at the forefront of this legislative battle for years and serves as the Deputy Director for Transgender Justice for the ACLU. He's also been a part of a number of landmark legal victories for trans rights in the US, including the historic 2020 Supreme Court decision that firing someone for being gay or trans violates the Civil Rights Act.
Here we are in 2023, and the reality is that we've reached an escalation that is jarring and overwhelming, even for someone like me who's been in this work for a long time. Now we're at a point where there are about 400 or more bills introduced in state legislatures across the country targeting the LGBTQ community. The majority of those bills are very focused on targeting trans people. And I think what's categorically and fundamentally different about 2023 is the breadth of the legislation. So we're seeing bills that would criminalize restroom use for adults, for example, which would threaten to seize custody of children from parents if the parents are affirming of their gender identity. Really insidious, criminal, and otherwise punitive measures attacking the trans communities. And then there's also the aggressiveness with which they're being pushed. Lawmakers are coming into session saying a deal has been made, it's a done deal, there's nothing that can be done. And that's a really staggering place to be as an advocate.
When did these states start shifting their focus to targeting trans people, particularly gender affirming care in sports? When have you seen this sort of change?
If you look in the recent period of time, what we had was in the wake of the Obergefell decision, which was the Supreme Court decision striking down bans on marriage equality in 2015. After that, in 2016, that's when we saw all of the anti-trans bathroom bills. But that really shifted over the course of the period of time from 2016 to 2018. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them was that President Trump was in office. And so there was a less emphasis at the state level because there are so many attacks at the federal level. Starting in 2018, 2019, we start to see this real rhetorical shift in the way in which trans people are demonized, both in public discourse and in public policy. And in 2020, that is the first year that an anti-trans sports bill is passed into law in Idaho. And then between 2020 and 2023, we now have about 19 states. So really quickly, we've gone from 0 to almost half the country banning trans women and girls from sports. And alongside that were the attacks on gender affirming medical care, which have really reached a fever pitch in 2023.
What is the playbook behind some of these anti-trans bills? It seems like it's overwhelmingly targeting young people right now.
I think that we can look at some very particular organizations that are well-funded, that are operating centrally to push out model legislation that we then see across the country. There was this rhetoric that they utilized saying that, well, these are kids, we have to protect them, they don't know, what they're doing. Of course, that doesn't really hold water in any sense. If you take a step back and see the laws that they're actually pushing, it never had anything to do with children. They definitely were weaponizing false information about the medical care that adolescents receive. For example, prepubertal children do not get surgery, but they were stoking anxiety about these ideas to push these broad-based attacks on the trans community. And right now, what we're seeing and what trans people have said all along is that these pieces of legislation don't start and end with trans youth. We already see efforts to ban gender affirming care for trans adults. We see remarks from individuals at CPAC, for example, saying that transgenderism and the ideology of trans people is categorically false and must be eradicated from public life. What they believe at their core and what they say in legislatures and in litigation is that being a trans adult is a bad thing to be. And if we can stop children from becoming trans adult, that's a good outcome. Of course, the only way to stop trans children from becoming trans adults is to stop them from becoming adults at all. And that, I think, is what people really have to understand and really listen to what trans people are saying, which is you cannot make us untrans unless you make us not alive.
What are the effects of bans? What happens to children in those states who are looking for gender affirming care?
These bills don't just prospectively ban care, and in many cases, they ban care for those already receiving it, or those who are imminently planning to initiate treatment. So I can give the example of Arkansas, where in 2021, it became the first state to pass a ban on gender affirming care for adolescents. Thankfully, it's been blocked in court, but the introduction of the law alone led to a spike in suicide attempts among trans adolescents in the state, who were terrified at the prospect of losing care. Even if there were questions about how this care is being provided, the answer is never to categorically ban the care. If people want more research, banning the care doesn't lead to more research. What it leads to is more harm, more fear, and more families displaced by what we're seeing. And talking to these families is absolutely devastating.
What do you want conservative lawmakers who are pushing these bills to know about the effects of their legislation?
Well, I spent a lot of time talking to conservative lawmakers, and I think that conservative lawmakers do know about the effects of this legislation. In the states where there are hearings, these lawmakers are hearing doctors tell them that this is an absolute intrusion into best practice medicine, that patients are going to suffer, that patients are going to struggle, and that some will die. They have heard young people explain that this care has saved their lives. They've heard parents beg them not to override their judgment as parents. So they are well aware of the consequences of their actions, and they do not care.
Texas legislators have been attacking me since pre-K. I am in fourth grade now.
We cannot expect these extremely gerrymandered governments, these extraordinarily voter suppressed states to be listening to us and acting in accordance with anyone's best interests. It is incumbent upon us to take action collectively to fight back against the very insidious things that are happening right before our eyes.
Do you see this transphobia subsiding in the future?
It's sort of yes and no. In the immediate future, I think we can see nothing but escalation, and that is really scary and alarming for so many people. And at the same time, I do see changes that can't be undone. There are more people who feel comfortable living as their full authentic selves now than there were when I was growing up. And that does create a momentum. There are more people who are protesting in their schools right now against the anti-trans policies. There is resistance that is growing. I believe in the power of our continued ability to find and celebrate ourselves and hold our communities in love, moving us towards a future when we are going to have less of the vitriol that we're seeing and more of the celebratory manifestations of our really beautiful communities.
I'm Michael Learmont, editor-in-chief of Vice News. Too often, traditional news outlets shy away from the...
Okay, so that is a clip about transgender rights and the ongoing debates regarding transgender rights and legislation to protect trans people. Understanding that there is nothing natural or stable about human biology helps us dismantle the idea that women's oppression is rooted in a singular place. We can believe that sex and gender are made up categories embellished by social attitudes and recognize that the violence that occurs as a result of them is very real. It is the violence that defines our experience of the world, not our biological makeup, that we often know little about it. How often do you think about your chromosomes? Often being perceived as a woman or failing to do womanhood correctly is enough to put somebody at risk of harm. And finally, I'll discuss colonialism and gender. While many young feminists espouse TERF ideology, the public face of TERF organizing is often older, liberal, white, and middle-class women who vocalize concerns about the inclusion of trans women in feminist spaces and women's rights discourse, lamenting the generational divides in feminist thinking. They view the changing nature of language to describe gender and sexuality as a threat to feminist advancement, tending to be dismissive of newer kinds of feminist practice that take a radically materialist and intersectional approach as their starting point. What TERFs miss in their attempt to manufacture a moral panic about transgender people is that feminist thinking enables cis women to despise the social consequences of the sex we are assigned at birth and still comfortably occupy a gender that corresponds with it. To assume individuals transition flippantly suggests that medical transition is an easily available unnecessary luxury, when in reality it can often be one of the only routes to safety for trans people whose bodies have been deemed unruly by society. Under the guise of protecting women, TERF movements seek to reestablish strict gender codes. Whether through policing public bathrooms or making access to medical transition harder than it should be, they align themselves with the church and the state, who are not natural allies to feminists, in order to legitimize their agenda. By reoccupying the role of victims, cisgender women are able to frame themselves as the recipients of a kind of onslaught from a group of people that make up less than 1% of the population. Concerns of female erasure are central to TERF arguments, but what is most frightening is the way they have successfully merged transphobia with right-wing rhetoric about threats to freedom of speech and the sensitivity of younger generations, turning the younger generation's practice of a feminism that refuses to betray trans women into the result of political correctness. Another popular TERF argument is that instead of challenging the gender binary, transitioning merely affirms it. To argue that trans women simply reaffirm a stereotypically feminine model is to see all trans women as a homogeneous group, feminine, heterosexual, and wanting to transition. It ignores the fact that cis and trans women adopt stereotypical femininity for the same reason, blaming them for the gendered scripts necessary for survival. In many cases, trans women may be actively encouraged by doctors and gender identity clinics to adopt conventional femininity as a means of proving that they are who they say they are. This proof would not be necessary in a different world. These kinds of requirements have far less to do with individuals and more to do with the way rigid ideas about gender are currently embedded in our social lives. The aim, at very least, is to destroy that rigidity. Trans exclusionary radical feminists have not only created a false dichotomy between cisgender and transgender women, they have managed to distract our attention away from the structures that determine the conditions of our lives and, more importantly, ensure that all women are not free. We are all implicated in the violence against trans people when we allow their lives and the harm they face to be diminished by a media circus, or when we enable TERFs to set the feminist narrative. As feminists, we have a duty to dismantle that circus and redirect the public imagination. Trans life is fundamental to our collective liberation. So finally, I'll finish with this quote: "To operate within the matrix of power is not the same as to replicate uncritically relations of domination." And this is from Judith Butler, Gender, Trouble, Feminism, and the Subversion of Identity. So for this class, I want to then consider the ways that objectivity in science has been mobilized against transgender rights and transgender people historically, and the ways that standpoint epistemology, which is a philosophy that was first created by Sandra Harding, can be used in the sciences to look at the ways that, while obviously objective material reality exists and objective numbers exist in science, the way that we make sense of science in relation to human life is obviously a question of ideology. So ideology is a concept from Marx, and ideology is a concept that Marx uses to suggest that they do not know what they are doing, and yet they are doing it. So we participate in capitalist ideology, we reproduce hierarchies of power, and we do not know what we are doing. And another concept from Marx is the concept of commodity fetishism. So we can ask how the commodification of gender through consumerism shapes our understanding of normative gender identity. And this is true in the advancement of a body beautiful image that is often an image of a cisgender body. And we can think about the ways that health and the idea of health is often not neutral, but inextricable from commodity fetishism. and from the use of a language of science to actually foster a consumer-driven ideal. Finally, I think that the work of Sandra Harding in standpoint epistemology and feminist standpoint epistemology is a way of understanding what science can actually mean in an individual person's life. So rather than thinking of science as a form of paternal authority that dictates we must all live and die in the same way, how can science be used by individual actors such as transgender people to support their own life story, their own life narrative, and their own gender identity or expression? So
So I'm going to finish the class then by playing this clip of a conference that was recently held at Harvard University about transgender people and gender affirming healthcare. And because of the passage of Bill-C16, Canada, I think, is ahead or is more open, perhaps, than other countries that have been legislating against gender affirming healthcare. So this is a conference that was held at Harvard regarding gender affirming healthcare. And the laws in Canada are relatively new. C16 was only passed a few years ago.
Hey Tara, I have a question.
Sure.
Are we watching the whole hour of this video?
No.
Oh, okay, thanks.
I'll put it online if in case you have time to watch it, but no, we're not going to watch the whole thing. I just want to play some clips of it because it talks about the law. So Canada, I think, is interesting to think about. And if you're interested in thinking about these issues for your presentation, you could think about it in terms of how fast the laws have been changing, and then people have sometimes contested the law, and then they change again. So British Columbia, like Canada, has a province by province set of mandates regarding gender affirming care. So gender and gender expression is a really individual set of choices, and healthcare needs for people along the spectrum are just as varied. And in British Columbia, patients have to work with primary care providers to have one or more surgical readiness assessments completed with a qualified assessor. And there are a whole series of surgeries that are covered by Canadian healthcare, and there are other surgeries that are not. Mainly things that are cosmetic, like hair removal or hair restoration, are not covered by Canadian healthcare. But other surgeries regarding body are like chest construction, vaginoplasty. All of these are covered. So it is interesting to think about how medicine is trying to keep up with these debates and with the legal changes, because the US has had this whole set of legal precedents that are passed in favor of gay rights, transgender rights, abortion. Then the laws are often overturned by conservatives, and then the medical system has to adjust to legal changes. So this is a clip about the US, and we'll just watch some of it so we can think about. I think it's interesting to think now because Canada has just passed C16. So right now we have comprehensive laws protecting gender identity and gender expression. And hopefully these laws will remain intact.
Good afternoon, and welcome to our panel discussion on the fight for gender-affirming healthcare. My name is Ariel Ross, and I'm a correspondent and podcast host at Vice News. I'm also the host of a YouTube show called Queer Sports, also for Vice, and I'm your moderator today. Right now, trans rights are under attack by lawmakers and others who are seeking to restrict an array of day-to-day activities, from bathroom use to pronoun use to sports participation and healthcare. Today, we will look at the current state of gender-affirming healthcare and the impact of those restrictions, particularly on youth. We will also look at what can be done to protect access to safe, effective, and medically necessary care. Joining me today are Arlie Christian, campaign strategist at the ACLU, President Andrea Jenkins, the president of the Minneapolis City Council and the first Black openly trans woman to be elected to office in the US. She will be joining us a little bit later. She had a scheduling conflict, so maybe in like 20 minutes, you'll be able to hear from her. Dr. Angela Cade Gepford, Medical Director of Children's Minnesota Gender Health Program, and Alana Redfield, Federal Policy Director at the Williams Institute, UCLA School of Law. Thank you all so much for being here. Before we get started, I have a note for our audience. Our discussion will cover mental health needs, including suicide risk. So if you are experiencing suicidal thoughts, please call the National Crisis Lifeline at 988. The first question that I have is pretty straightforward, but it's important for us to actually cover this, which is what exactly is gender-affirming care? What falls under the umbrella of this care? Dr. Gepford?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, so it's a great place to start. At its simplest, gender-affirming care is developmentally appropriate care that's about understanding a young person's gender experience. So when someone goes to a gender health program, what they're looking for is a supportive place where young people and their parents can ask questions of medical and mental health professionals who specialize in this care. It is important to understand that it's rooted in science and decades of research. It's also important to understand that it's really individualized, so it's unique for each person that comes in. Often it involves no medical treatment at all. So a lot of it is supporting where a young person and their family are at. There are non-medical interventions like shapewear or voice therapy or helping to affirm someone's physical appearance with haircuts and clothing, affirming someone's name and pronouns, helping make legal changes or helping with school systems. And then in certain cases, it can involve medications. For young people, those medications are often reversible, either in suppressing puberty or starting an early phase of a masculinizing or feminizing process. And it almost never involves surgical care.
Thank you so much for that. I'd now like to ask each of you to share in a sentence or two, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions about gender-affirming care, right? Maybe, I don't know, who would like to start us off? Maybe Arlie?
Absolutely. It's a great question. And, you know, there's so many misconceptions about gender-affirming care, but I'll start off with a sort of more fun one. One common misconception about gender-affirming care is that it's anyone's business except the patient, right? And their families and their providers that are working with them. And I think this is kind of a commonly understood practice for most types of healthcare, that you work with your medical professionals to understand your options and the risks involved and the benefits involved, and you talk to your families and you discover that you figure out the best path forward. Often deeply personal decisions about your own care, but that seems to be a misconception that with gender-affirming care, that politicians get to weigh in on what kinds of treatment we are receiving.
Alana, do you want to jump in?
Sure. So another misconception I think is really important is this idea that gender-affirming care is special care. But actually, when we're talking about gender-affirming care, we're so often talking about treatments that are available to a broad range of people, and are just actually, we're talking about specifically them being denied to transgender people.
Right. Dr. Gepford?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many, but probably from my perspective as a pediatrician, one of the biggest misconceptions is that
parents are somehow not involved in this care. And the reality is that as a pediatrician, I can't provide any care to any child for any reason without a parental consent of some kind. And that includes gender affirming care. So parents are absolutely involved in the care. They're often driving the care and really the ones interested in asking a lot of questions and learning more information. So that's probably a misconception I'd really like to set the record straight on.
I know that I'm not, a panelist here, but from my experience, one of the misconceptions that I've seen most is that therapy isn't involved in the process. And I'm kind of wondering if any one of you would like to jump in and just talk about that a little bit.
Sure, I think that goes along with another misconception, which is that somehow the care is fast or it's easy to access, or you walk into a doctor's office and walk away with a prescription for hormones. And that's just not how gender affirming care works, particularly when we're talking about young people. So the standards of care do involve a mental health professional of some kind who's helping work on a discernment process, helping work on capacity for decision making, helping work on all of those things alongside a young person and their family. And the process of deciding on any treatment for a young person would happen over months to years. So this is not a quick, fast process of any kind.
Yeah, I mean, just to give, the people who are listening to this an idea, like I'm getting top surgery in August. I had to provide my initial assessment very many months ago, a letter from a therapist that I had been seeing for at least a year. And so now we're like on a 2-year process getting me up to August, right? And I am an adult. So to assume that would be any different or any easier for a child under the age of 18 sounds, it's just very interesting that that's where people's minds are going.
I'm sorry. I want to
go ahead.
Which is that science overwhelmingly supports access to gender affirming care. And so in addition to these rigorous standards that Dr. Gephardt described, they've been studied for decades and decades, that a lot of thought and research and everything has gone into developing these standards of care to make sure that they are effective and keep everyone's best interest in mind.
Right. Alana, I'm glad that you jumped in because you co-authored a report at the Williams Institute that estimated that almost 150,000 trans youth in 30 states have lost access to gender affirming care or are at risk of losing it due to pending legislation. Can you bring us up to speed? What's the latest on these state level bans?
Sure. So thank you for the question, Ariel. And the report came out at the beginning of the legislative session. And so now we know much more about what the landscape looks like.
Yeah.
So we have 20 states now which have enacted bans on gender affirming care for minors. And Louisiana has is sort of in a place where it will likely pass a ban, although we haven't seen it pass yet. There's also a few more states that are considering bans still at this late stage of the game. The state legislature sessions tend to run sort of like January to June, although there's some variation. But we estimate now, if you include Louisiana, that around 98,000 trans youth live in states where the care that they need is being curtailed, or someone is attempting to ban that care. And that would apply in most cases to all the care that Dr. Gephardt described. Although there's some variations, right? So, there are some laws that would allow puberty blockers, but would ban other types of hormone treatments. And there, at least one state bans only surgery, but allows other treatments. But nonetheless, there are a tremendous number of states that are targeting the care in some form. And that's also on top of a number of states that ban coverage for gender affirming care under Medicaid plans or state insurance plans. So there are around 11 states that do that in some form. And actually, let me roll that back. There are 10 states because Florida, we recently just got a decision, we'll talk about today, I hope, that overturned Florida's ban on gender affirming care under Medicaid. So that's very exciting.
I mean, if you want to talk about it now, by all means.
Well, sure. And I'm sure all of us have feelings about it. But the decision was issued in a case called Decker versus WIDA, and it's around access to care for both minors and adults under Florida's Medicaid plan. And it really is a broad decision that pulls in excellent science and just looks at what they're trying to do with the ban in Florida. There's a couple different bans in Florida, but it basically says that these bans are based on flawed science and they're not consistent with the best practices for treating transgender young people.
Okay, I'll stop it there. So the hope is that Bill C-16 will continue to be used as legislation at the provincial and federal level in Canada, and that gender affirming care will be accessible to all. So are there any questions about the assignments, the presentations, or the final assignment? Or any questions about the reading for this week by Slagstead? The presentation and the assignment, the final assignment, are both due at the end of the course now. I've extended the deadline, so you have until the end of term to submit both. And then I will submit your grades 1 week after the term finishes. So there isn't a final exam. So 1 week after you hand in your final assignments or the end of class, whichever is first, I will submit your final grade online. Are there any questions? If you think about questions about the presentation or final assignment, please let me know. We can, I can email you back, but we can also meet over Zoom at another time. The office hours for the class are by appointment, so please feel free to contact me and book an appointment if you want to discuss your assignment online. If you want to discuss your assignment idea with me one-on-one. Okay, so that's the class for this week. Another thing is about the first test. If you have any questions about the first test mark, or you feel like it wasn't marked properly, or for some reason you can't access your mark, please let me know and I'll check it for you. Make any necessary corrections. Okay, that's all for this week.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll try to have more of a discussion next week. I'll think of more discussion questions regarding the readings so we can have more discussion. But that's all for this week, and I look forward to seeing your assignments. Thanks. Have a good week. I hope you're all doing well. Thank you. Bye.